Hello and welcome to this segment of Learning Characteristics of Students with Disabilities, SPED 6602. I'm Candace Southall, and I'm a professor with the Exceptional Child Education Department at Piedmont College. The contents of this module include perspectives of disability and some assessment basics. Next week we'll be digging deep into specific assessment administration, so it's important that we know some fundamentals of scoring and interpretation. Now, if you look at pages 3 and 4 of your Raymond textbook, you will read a story about a kindergartner named Benny. Benny enters kindergarten lacking academic readiness and is considered for evaluation and eligibility for a possible intellectual disability. Now, we'll learn more throughout this course exactly what that means to have an intellectual disability, but you should know now it is different from, say, a learning disability or autism. They are specific categories that allow for a student to be eligible to receive special education services. But anyway, Benny's story is common for young children. We're introduced to the dilemma of labeling students early to allow them to get services, or not labeling them to allow for more time in development and ensuring higher expectations. But we also see the added piece of cultural diversity versus disability. It's difficult to tease apart individual disabilities and individual differences in order to provide services, keep expectations high, while still avoiding learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is the condition that results from having repeated failures that causes a student to have a lack of motivation and to stop trying. So take a second to read about Benny and think about what you've learned from the story. Now, if you were Benny's teacher, what do you think you would need to know to decide what actions to help Benny? Perhaps you're thinking that you need to know his personal history. What are his response to intervention or RTI data? Was there fidelity in previous instruction? Did he have previous instruction? And you'd want to know some family and cultural information. Do you think we need a label? This is a concern that will be raised throughout this course. Of course, we use labels and we use categories of disability to provide services, to draw that line between a student who is eligible for services or not. Do you know the 13 categories for being eligible for special education? You're going to find that information in the module, so be sure to look out for that. It'll be important to know. You'll also get a description of those, so that can also be quite helpful for you moving forward as a teacher. Here we have some terms that could be important for you to understand as we move forward. First of all, special education. Special education is defined as specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability at no cost to parents. Related services are services under special education that help the students benefit from that special education. It includes physical therapy, occupational therapy, transportation, adapted PE, assistive technology, and others. Now, direct services are really just any therapeutic related service that allows the student to benefit from special education. That would be specifically like physical, speech, occupational type therapies. Now we have two terms, non-categorical and categorical, that contrast each other. Now, we are currently finding students eligible for special education based on the categorical approach. And this has been around since the special education law has been in place. However, we have moved from serving students categorically to non-categorically. You're going to learn a lot more about that as you read through the textbook, but essentially it helps us to provide services to students on an individual basis and individualize those programs if we look at the student needs, strengths, and weaknesses rather than putting them together based on a category of disability, because there is a lot of overlap of student needs across different categories. So it doesn't make sense to serve only students with autism together in one group and only students with learning disabilities all in one group, when one student with autism and another student with a learning disability could have a similar need, and it would make sense to serve them together and also in the general curriculum. And then we have the difference between the terms disability and handicap. The original law had the use of the word handicap in the language. However, it was changed in the 1980s to remove the word handicap and use the word disability instead. Why? A disability is a condition that a person possesses. It is, however, only one characteristic of that individual. A disability is identified when an expected, specific human ability is curtailed or absent. Quite simply, it's the lack of ability, and it's a measurable condition. By itself, it implies absolutely nothing about the individual and his ability to carry out desired life functions. However, a handicap results from the interaction that occurs with the condition and the environment. A handicap results when the environment cannot or will not be modified to permit the individual to carry out certain functions. So it's a problematic interaction that results from interference with the individual's ability to carry out a desired function. For example, Ellen, who has myopia, which is a result of a measurable lack of vision, distance vision. In fact, her unaided visual acuity is over 2200 in both eyes. So we would be accurate in saying that she has a visual disability because she lacks visual acuity that we would expect people to have. However, since her vision is amenable to correction and she has been provided with glasses, she is not handicapped in tasks such as acquiring information from text or in mobility, like driving a car. If she broke her glasses or her vision was uncorrectable with glasses, she would be handicapped in acquiring information from text or moving about, unless she had friends or family to help her to find another way to carry out the functions. So, in a nutshell, we use the term disability to describe the condition of our students. However, we know that there are ways to adapt the environment or provide accommodation so that students don't have to be handicapped by the disability. So the majority of students being served by special education are in the mild range of disability. Since the classification system used to categorize learners with mild disabilities evolved upward from the terminology developed to connote more serious disabilities, and since this classification system often does not adequately describe these learners, study of the population by itself may be more useful. So we'll be learning initially about mild disabilities as a whole instead of learning disabilities versus behavior disorder versus other mild disabilities. Of course, we have to learn the characteristics of those specific areas, but for the most part, we will be talking about the manifestations of having a mild disability and how that impacts the classroom. Students with mild disabilities are often similar to others who have problems learning. So understanding the life experiences of those milder levels of disability may help us also serve similar but not yet classified learners. So the idea is that we can support all learners early on. Struggling learners or students identified as having a disability. Ultimately, our goal is to ensure that all students have access and are able to benefit to education. So let's take a look here at these different mild disabilities and how they might be broken down. The text makes a point to say that mild doesn't mean severe. Physically, these students appear as if they should be able to learn and behave like typical students. Sometimes that can be actually more detrimental than having an obvious disability because expectations are set differently and students can be blamed for their failures. These students can approximate age-appropriate behaviors, but their disabilities may cause them to be enough off the pace to compromise their success. When a disability, even a slightly impaired disability, affects the ability to function, it can lead to failure in ordinary activities and have a disastrous effect on self-esteem and a sense of competence. Here we see specific learning disability is our highest incidence disability, amounting to almost a half of all students served in special education. But we also have emotional disturbance, or that's how it's federally named, but in Georgia we have emotional behavior disorder, intellectual disability, autism, other health impairment, and speech and language impairment. How have identification, eligibility, and services changed over time? Interestingly enough, in 1976 school year, when the special education law rolled out, we had about 3,700,000 students served. And over time, we see almost a doubling of that number. But since we have seen this double, we haven't really seen a lot of growth over the 10 years since, which is interesting to see how the numbers have changed. See, the number for autism, which seems to be an epidemic, has over doubled. The total number of students served has not. Therefore, we can pretty safely see from this data that students are being identified probably more accurately than they were previously, when not as much was known about autism and other disorders. So, the definitions for these areas of disability are not now and never have been distinct enough to establish sharp boundaries among and between categories. That's why we see that flex in the different numbers served in schools. So these learners may all exhibit learning and academic difficulties, problems with cognitive processing of information that includes attention deficits, problems in social-emotional adjustment, language-related deficits. By the 2000s, a significant majority of states had become non-categorical for certification, remaining categorical certification primarily for the teachers of students with deafness, hard of hearing, or low vision. If you look in your textbook on page 7 to 8, you can see we need to focus on the effects of a student's ability to function. And that's really how we can use the categories, but at the same time plan individually for students. So what are the advantages of and problems with using categories to classify students with disabilities? Think about this. There's an example in your textbook with a student named Jane. Jane shows up on summary school records and state reports as mentally retarded, educable. Now, that's terminology used about a decade ago. Now we use intellectual disability, but essentially the same idea here. What's not recorded is that Jane cannot read, that she is attractive and pleasant, that she needs dental care, and that she's good with children and has held a job at child care with a family for 5 years. And there's no record of services needed. So, what are the advantages and problems of using categories? Think about it. Perhaps the advantage is that these students can qualify for services, and we can allocate funding for those resources. It indicates why there are challenges in learning and relevance for the treatment. And research a lot of times can tell us what works based on a common demographic or common profile of a student, so that we know we can pick the best strategies based on research. And it can also indicate the direct service or credentials for a person. It allows society to maintain stability, to isolate deviant members. What do you think about that one? Is this just a social construct? The classification system is designed as a vehicle for communication about a person's disability, although it frequently implies some degree of stigma. So we have to balance those advantages of having the category with the stigma that we could be putting on a student. I want you to watch this quick video. I think you'll appreciate what this man has to say.